Guess the topics kind of carry things. So we've got a good crowd tonight, and we're glad that you all are here. A couple things to bring up. Our next, we actually have 4 quarterly meetings. That's our real meetings. All the rest of this is just lectures that we set up and try to do monthly. But our real organizational meetings are 4 times a year. So our next quarterly will be at the end of this month, and it'll be at this Civic Center, Herrin Civic Center, in the auditorium at 2 o'clock, and it'll be a conversation with the 1957 Herrin basketball team. So we hope to see you all. And we've got a few more things coming up, and you'll hear about those in just a little bit. I'm Philip Stucker, and I'm the president, and if we have some board members that are in here already, we'd like to recognize you. Ron Wade. Ron does the newsletter. And so if you ever have anything to contribute, see him. And I see Gordon back here, and Donald, our secretary, and a couple of our members are off on, 3 board members are off on vacation right now, I think, so they're not here. And is there anyone that I missed because I've not seen real well? Okay, and we have Cheryl over here in the doorway, and I'm kind of leaving her for last because she's the one I'm going to pull up. But once again, we're very happy that you're here, and we do like to be a forum for the history topics of Herrin. And with our historic lectures, it's always based on who volunteers to talk. So if anybody ever wants to talk to us, just come up and get signed in. We can either work out an evening meeting like this, or we can work out an afternoon, the Friday afternoons at 2 o'clock that we usually do because GED's not in here on Fridays. I'm going to ask, first I want to thank Bill. Bill's been, raise your hand. He's been filming these lectures for us this past year. In conjunction with the library, we helped get a camera here, and I want everyone to, if they get a chance, come and look at the bulletin board over here. It's been put up by Lisa here at the library, and it shows some of the various discs that we have now where these lectures are being put on, what do you call it, CD?
Yeah.
Round things.
Yeah, and round things, not an album.
and they can be checked out through the library. So if there's some that you've missed and you'd like to see, hopefully sometimes we can repeat some of the earlier ones that we had the first year or so. And we have our dear friend Jim here who's given like 3 or 4 already, and we wish we had those tape, but we have that now, and it really helps it. And Sam who's been very active with us. We've got one with a conversation with him on there, so I just read that a while ago when I set the room up. Yeah, that's how I know that. Okay, I'd like to bring Cheryl Trent up, and she is going to tell you about some of our programs coming up as well as the program we have tonight. And this is our PR chairman.
We're very lucky to have Phil Stucker as president of the Herrin Area Historical Society. He is a retired history teacher from the state of Texas, but he's also a native of Herrin, and we're very appreciative of everything he does. You notice that he's not high-tech because he didn't remember what the round things are called. He is a very...
That's when I retired, when all that started.
He's a very good historian. We are very pleased to have as many of you here as have shown up. It's a very nice crowd, and we have some programs that we think you will find interesting in the weeks to come. I also want to welcome someone, though, who is a great friend of mine. She grew up with me as a Herrin High School graduate, a college graduate as well. And she is from Shelbyville, Kentucky, has come back here to make her home. And she was the historical restoration chairman, and she may have a better title than what I'm saying, but Gail Reed from the city of Herrin. We're very glad to have her.
Thank you, Cheryl.
We welcome amateur historians and professional historians. And I hope each of you who may have missed some of the shows, I call them shows because they're so fabulous, the programs that we've had that Bill and Lisa Carnaghi have put together. Lisa is actually on staff here, and that's why she has done some really great things with our Herrin History Room. If you have time this evening, get out of here before 8 o'clock. There are wonderful displays in the back of this library pertinent to the Herrin Massacre, not just where the bodies are, but the things that led up to it and the very interesting things. John Tidwell, who was one of the top players on the class of 57 for Herrin High School, has not been back to Herrin for 50 years, and he will be here on September 28th at 2 p.m. here in the Civic Center with all of the remaining members of the class of 57, the basketball players. I mean, if you scratch us from Herrin, we're basketball nuts. That's our claim to fame. We got the state championship that year. We also, on October 12th, if any of you are Saluki fans, we hope you'll come and wear your Saluki shirts. We're going to have the Saluki dogs here, and they are owned by Vicki and Jim Blair from Energy, and they've had Saluki dogs when they lived in Pennsylvania. So there's much to know about the history of the dogs, and then this wonderful connection to Southern Illinois University. So that's on October 12th. Also, we were just talking about Taylor Pensino and Gordon Pruitt, who is with the Norris Library. We're very lucky to have him on board, and that is the book drop. He is going to be here on November 9th, so we hope that you can join us for that as well. I also want to call something to your attention, and I'm a postcard nut. We now have a whole variety of postcards that Lisa Carnaghi has put together. They're $1 each, and they're for sale in the library, and all of the proceeds go to the Herrin History Library Room. So I bought Northside School. My friend Rosemary Mathis and her sister, we all went to Northside when it looked like that. And we also have Southside School, which was the larger school.
That used to be the high school too. That's the old convent building first, before the 1912 was built up where it is now.
The other thing I want to call to your attention is the John A. Logan College Historical Village, the Harrison Woods Historical Village, is now open for public tours, and the first one will be October 2nd. And if you have a paper, then you can come to those as well. So, without further talk from me, thank you for coming. We know why you came. This is an intense subject in Southern Illinois, perhaps in all of Illinois, the Herrin Massacre. Jake Pretty is a well-known woodworker here in the city of Herrin. He's retired. He did used to work at ISON. He and his wife Linda have brilliant children, and they are brilliant people as well. And he has put together a research team, and they just meshed. He said they just got together, they all enjoyed their conversations and their research. So tonight, Jake is going to present their perspective on where the bodies are buried. There are many, not many, but there are other thoughts as to where these bodies are. I've often heard that the cemetery sextons at Herrin City Cemetery know where they are, but they would never tell it because they don't want the city to come and dig up the cemetery. So we will find out tonight what Jake Pretty and his group have found, and the members of his team, and I want them to stand up because they worked so hard. We have Jake, of course, who's going to be our speaker, Doris Grant Fry, Brent Horn, who I think is not able to be with us tonight, Jack Odom, who is a history buff per excellence, and Linda Pretty, Jake's wife. So let's welcome them. And Jake is going to tell us about his findings tonight. Jake Pretty.
Thank you, Cheryl. I'm going to try to speak up. I'm a little bit challenged with cold right now, but let me know if anybody can't hear me. I'll just try a little bit harder. We'd like to thank the Herrin Area Historical Society for graciously hosting tonight's program. We'd also like to thank Mike Kepper, Linda Banks, and most especially Lisa Carnaghi for making the resources of the Linda Jennings Banks History Room available to us. Lisa cheerfully, tirelessly, and enthusiastically provided us with whatever history room materials were available for our research. There's a principle I try to live by. Find out what you don't do well, and then don't do it. I hope that after tonight, I don't have to add public speaking to the long and growing list of things I want to do. This project was the unintended outgrowth of a conversation between Jack Odom and Brent Horn, which quickly captured the imagination of the rest of us. Soon we found ourselves messaging one another, comparing notes, and speculating on the subject at all hours. As we began looking at the scant photographic record of the victim's burial, our research took an unexpected turn that ultimately led to the conclusions we're presenting tonight. To preserve continuity, we'd appreciate it if you would reserve your questions and comments until after the formal presentation. For reasons that will soon become apparent, we have entitled our presentation, Shadows of the Past, The Search for Potter's Field. In the 27th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, we read, "Then Judas, which had betrayed him, when he saw that he was condemned, repented himself and brought again the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, I have sinned in that I have betrayed the innocent blood. And they said, What is that to us? See thou to that. And he cast down the pieces of silver in the temple, and departed, and went out and hanged himself. And the chief priests took the silver pieces and said, It is not lawful for us to put them into the treasury, because it is the price of blood. And they took counsel and bought with them the potter's field to bury strangers in." Since Matthew penned this first century narrative, any area provided for the burial of indigents has been called Potter's Field. Records in Herrin as early as 1915 mention Potter's Field in connection with burials in the city cemetery, but they do not specifically identify the location. To our knowledge, no area officially designated as such appears on any map or document. Those intimately acquainted with the Herrin Cemetery and its history tell us that the traditional Potter's Field is a low-lying, undefined part of the swale that angles across the cemetery, where the destitute were buried on unsaleable lots. It would be reasonable to believe that print accounts of the massacre victims' burials refer to this same area when the term Potter's Field is applied. Reasonable, but not necessarily correct. Certainly, Chatelain Parker, author of the Herrin Massacre, the first full-length account of the violence and its aftermath, knew the precise location of the graves. Unfortunately, his book includes no useful description of their whereabouts. Paul M. Angle, author of Bloody Williamson, reported that he was shown the burial site while visiting Herrin in 1951. But like Parker, Angle provided no specifics, only noting that after 29 years, there was nothing left to see. Some today are convinced that the victims were buried in the historic Potter's Field. A few months ago, an article appeared in the Harrisburg Daily Register, accompanied by an unequivocal declaration that the site of the burial, presumably in the traditional Potter's Field, was fully absorbed into the cemetery within a few years. Those who insist that the burials took place in that area do so in spite of the fact that repeated searches of official records, as well as physical searches of the cemetery itself, have failed to uncover any supporting evidence. They also disregard one of the more definitive contemporary statements regarding the site. In September of 1922, a local paper ran an article about the American Legion's investigation of the burial of Antonio Malkovich, a World War I veteran who was among those killed. The article states, Atwood, the American Legion representative from Chicago, heard that the Malkovich body was buried in the Potter's Field. But when he reached Herrin, he found it was buried in a new part of the Herrin City Cemetery. So he arranged for flowers to be placed on the grave and for a monument to be erected, leaving the body in Herrin. Furthermore, there is a conspicuous absence of cemetery records connected with these burials. Even though death certificates were issued for every victim, and the coroner's report identifies each by name or by number in the case of unknowns, and even though Albert G. Storm, the Herrin undertaker who supervised the burials, assigned the numbered remains to specific graves to facilitate exhumations, aside from the death certificates, no official record of the victim's interment in or removal from the Herrin Cemetery has ever been found. Were the records misplaced or destroyed? Have they been taken? Was there official malfeasance? Or is it just possible, as certain city officials insist and some oral traditions maintain, that the graves were never within what is now the platted grid of the cemetery? Researchers are limited by the availability of resources. It is understandable that in the absence of direct evidence, investigators would turn their attention to the larger body of printed material, newspaper accounts, books, magazines, articles, and so forth. While this is a reasonable and necessary part of scholarly research, exclusive reliance on such sources carries certain risks. It must be constantly borne in mind that the objectivity of authors and journalists is not guaranteed. That journalists are only as good as their sources, that even the most consummate professional may occasionally allow personal feelings to influence their choice of words. Some have conflicts of interest, and still others are driven more by the desire to write a good story than to give meticulous attention to detail. Perceptions are shaped by words, and words are chosen based on the writer's perspective and intent. Between truth and perceived truth, there can be a wide gulf. Responding to the national outcry and indignation over the Lester mine killings, the press, often relying on second and third-hand sources, spared neither excoriating prose nor inflammatory rhetoric in the rush to pronounce judgment on Herrin and its inhabitants. And their readers ate it up. Condemnation was virtually universal outside our immediate area. In such a setting, is it not possible that reporters and commentators use the generic term, Potter's Field, for its literary and pejorative effect rather than for literal reportage? Clothing themselves in biblical metaphor, writers evoked an image of the people of Herrin as savages, devoid of common decency, so venomous that their hatred could be satiated only by a final, gratuitous act of scorn, begrudging the victims of their bloodlust even the right to share the consecrated soil of their cemetery. To further illustrate our point, consider the media accounts that spoke of the dead being buried in pine boxes. It is true that a casket, by definition, is a sort of box. And no doubt, these had pine components. But a photograph of the caskets awaiting burial shows modern, nicely finished, tastefully trimmed units with decorative hardware. In all likelihood, these were superior to what many hard-working, upright, but impecunious families were able to provide for their loved ones. If we give the authors the benefit of the doubt and concede that the caskets might even have been solid pine, their reports still don't pass the smell test. Another popular theme with the press was that of contrasting the large public funerals of slain UMWA miners with the simple, lightly attended graveside service for the strikebreakers to illustrate Herrin's apparent contempt for civilized behavior. But when all is said and done, what is the unembellished story? Two local boys, both veterans of the recent war, were given better send-offs than strangers. Really? Granted, it makes better press than funeral for strangers, poorly attended, or graveside service, somber, subdued. But in the absence of some appalling spectacle or act of gross impropriety, the media portrayed a quiet, dignified memorial service as more evidence of Herrin's moral depravity. As we attempt to shed light on the mystery surrounding the burial of those killed on that tragic day, let us forsake our reliance on the written and spoken word, disabuse ourselves of preconceptions, disregard popular notions, set aside anecdote and folklore, and see where the scant but impeccably honest photographic record leads us in the cool light of reason. To our knowledge, there are but 5 extant photographs of the burial site or activities associated with the burial. You've already seen one. It is the newspaper image of the caskets at the bottom of the present slide. Of all the pictures, this one probably provides the least information. Still, it is instructive in that it puts the lie to the pine box myth. The most useful of the photographs is a good quality glossy that shows the opening of the graves probably on June 24th, 1922. What can we gather from the picture? Well, first, the distinct shadow beneath the lone tree in the left background is clear evidence that the time of day is near noon. Furthermore, the passenger door and the radiator of the car are in shadow, a point demonstrated more clearly by the negative image in which shaded areas stand out in white. Notice how the door and radiator are as white as the undersides of the fenders. What do we make of this? As the diagram shows us, on and around June 24th of any given year at our latitude, the sun is in the southern half of the sky from about 8:15 in the morning until roughly 3:45 in the afternoon, Central Standard Time. For a car to have its passenger door and radiator simultaneously in shade, it must have faced either west before noon or north after noon. Let's consider each of these possibilities. Returning to the photograph, it is obvious that the car is parked parallel to the lengths of the new graves. In other words, both the graves and the car are oriented the same way. Now, if the car faced north, that would mean that the graves ran north and south also, contrary to Christian tradition and cemetery practice. Surely such an act of sacrilege and contempt, such a brazen affront to propriety, would have been noted and exploited by the press. Yet, as far as we know, there is no reference to it in print, nor has it passed down to us through any oral history. Nor apparently did Atwood, the American Legion representative, find anything unseemly about the burial. Having eliminated any other possibility, we're left with the car facing west, a short time before noon, a condition wholly compatible with all the evidence we've found. This brings us to a critical point. If the car faced west, as the evidence overwhelmingly suggests, then the fence row and the section of cemetery visible in the background could only have been east of the new graves. Now, if the victims were buried in the traditional Potter's Field just east of the original survey, that would place the section of cemetery seen in the background within the platted area of the 1923 cemetery addition. But a physical canvass of the cemetery, confirmed by an examination of Charla Murphy Schroeder and Helen Soot Lynn's exhaustive inventory of marked graves, shows that in 1922 there was no more than a dozen gravestones scattered over the 10 acres east of the original survey. In other words, there was no concentration of marked graves such as we see in the photograph, north, south, or east of Potter's Field. To put it in the simplest terms, any conclusive evidence that the fence row, and consequently the cemetery, lay east of the victim's burial site demonstrates the impossibility of their burial being anywhere east of the original survey of the cemetery. This rules out the historic Potter's Field, as well as any area adjacent to it. Convinced that a burial in the historic Potter's Field was irreconcilable with the photographic evidence, we looked for alternatives to the west. We found that a location immediately west of the cemetery was the only area topographically compatible with the photography. Furthermore, a site beyond the west end of the cemetery proper accounts for the presence of the fence as well as the rank growth of weeds so soon after Memorial Day. Closer examination of the picture reveals what appears to be a roadway bordering the north edge of the cemetery in the background. Both of the westernmost sections of cemetery, sections A and E, are bounded on the north by roadways. However, the roadway north of section A is the frontage road parallel to Stotler. That would have put the burial in the most prominent location possible, adjacent to Stotler Road and the first graves one would encounter coming from Herrin, an idea inconsistent with every account or theory yet put forward. The roadway, if a roadway it is, must be the central one. This satellite image of the cemetery shows the likely camera position and field of view based on the evidence provided by the photograph. The next picture is taken from the Herrin Massacre by Chartland Parker and shows the grave of Antonio Malkovich. The obvious shadows almost directly to the left of both the marker and the floral arrangement are ample evidence that the marker faces west. At no time of the year does a standing object cast a shadow on its south side through the day. The marker could only have faced west. And because it faced west, so must the legible sides of the card holders marking the other graves in the picture. It's right there and there, the little funeral card holders. Having established that the Malkovich marker faced west, the fence, dimly but definitely apparent in the background, had to have been east of the graves. The fence is much more apparent in the next picture. The card holders, which you've already established as facing west, are plainly visible facing to the left of the picture. Once again, this puts the fence row squarely east of the new graves, consistent with all the evidence compiled so far. West being to the left of the picture, the line of sight running diagonally from left to right across the graves must be very nearly northeast. A new feature of special interest and importance presents itself in this picture. It's a building in the background at right. If we are correct in our assessment of the camera angle, the structure must have been on the north side of Stotler Road and well to the east, approaching the area of the existing Vandyville School. Fortunately for our purposes, what appears to be this same building shows up in a 1924 photo taken at the graveside service of Klansman Charles Waller. Because we know the precise location of the Waller grave, the surrounding topography, and the location of the wooded portion of the cemetery seen in the background, it is possible to reconstruct the position of the camera to within a matter of a few feet. The picture was taken on or near the south roadway, about 60 to 75 feet west of the Ora Thomas Monument, from an elevated position atop a ladder or a vehicle, and facing almost northeast like the previous picture. Knowing this information allows us to establish the location of the building north of Stotler Road and a bit west of Vanderbilt School. So we have two pictures taken at approximately the same camera angle, one showing a building in the right background, the other in the left. Let's go back to our satellite image and see how that works out. Coordinating the views puts the camera position of the newspaper image well to the west of that of the Wahlert photograph. In fact, it puts it west of the cemetery. The next photograph appeared in the Chicago Tribune. It shows the burial detail at a T intersection of the cemetery on the morning of June 25, 1922. Notice that the area between the two hearses is in full sun. If the party were facing north or south, this could only have happened around noon. But there is unanimity among all accounts of the burial that it took place early that Sunday morning. Furthermore, we know that the burial detail was composed of UMWA officials and rank-and-file members who were to attend the funeral of their fallen brother, Joseph Pitkowitz, that afternoon. This leaves the men, and therefore the T intersection, facing either east or west. There are no west-facing T intersections in the original part of the cemetery. Even if there were such, for the men to have been looking west with their faces in the sun and the area between the hearses in sunlight, the photograph would have had to have been taken sometime around 3:45 in the afternoon, a time conflicting with the activities associated with the Pitkowitz funeral, and furthermore, it would have required them to return to the cemetery with the hearses just to stage a photo. If, however, the picture was taken at the only east-facing T intersection in the cemetery, circled, shortly after 8:15 that morning, the faces of the men as well as the area between the hearses would have been in sunlight just as we saw. Returning once again to the Molkovich photograph, we see in the background the only wooded area of the cemetery, the grove at the northeast corner by Vanderbilt Road. The same grove seen in the background of the Wahlert picture. The lines of sight of both photographs appear to focus on the same central area of the woods. If we draw a line parallel to the right-hand edge of the grave and take that to represent the east-west axis, and then draw another line representing the line of sight to the woods, we find that they diverge at an angle of about 17 degrees. Consulting our satellite image again, beginning at a point approximating the center of the cemetery grove that formerly stood at the northeast corner, we extend a line westward at an inclination of 17 degrees to the south. Based on the information from the previous photograph, we could reasonably expect the Molkovich grave to lie somewhere on or near that line. Now let's see how the evidence gathered so far lines up. We'll begin with a satellite image showing the apparent field of view of the glossy photograph of the opening of the graves. To this, we will add the field of view of the newspaper image of the graves that has the building in the background. Next, we will insert the line of sight from the Molkovich grave to the woods. Finally, we will circle the area seen in the photograph of the burial detail. As you see, all of the photographic evidence converges on a single area west of the cemetery. The red rectangle at the left of the satellite view represents the area we believe contains the remains of the massacre victims. There's one remaining item that we'd like to share with you tonight. We do not offer it as hard evidence because in our minds, the resolution of the photographic feature on which it is based straddles the line between fact and speculation. Nonetheless, it is a fascinating curiosity. If we look very closely at what seems to be the closest tombstone in the picture, it appears as a sort of gray rectangular smudge with an odd whitish spot near its top, perhaps a blemish in the picture. When our group visited the cemetery for the first time to take a look at the area we had identified as the burial site, we tried, with this picture in hand, to reconstruct the camera position. When we believed we had done so, we began to compare what we saw with the various features of the photograph: the roadway, the distant tree line, the lay of the land, and the cemetery across the roadway. As we compared the section of cemetery in the picture with the scene that lay before us, we did a double take. As we walked toward the nearest headstone, this is what we saw. It was the tombstone of 19-month-old Mabel Stull, who was buried at that location not quite 4 years prior to the massacre. Near its top, gleaming in the noonday sun, was her white porcelain photograph. If the stone was erected soon after she died, it was there when the picture was taken. Not only that, but if our conclusions are correct, it should have appeared precisely where the smudge of the white dot appears in the photograph. This concludes our presentation. The work of our little group is complete. It is our earnest desire to see our conclusions either proved or disproved. But that is for others to pursue or not to pursue as they will. We have neither the mandate nor the means to do so. But as we surrender this project to its fate, we would make one final observation. There are some well-intentioned people who would like to see this whole matter simply go away. To them, we would suggest that selective history is not history. As the author Richard Bach has written, not being known does not stop truth from being true. Just as the black sheep is a part of the family, so this dark chapter is part of our history. The victims of that day were sons, fathers, husbands, and loved ones who paid with their lives for an ill-advised, probably desperate choice. Wherever they are beyond our help. What we do now, we must do for ourselves. For as long as the mystery of their final resting place persists, this issue will remain an open wound on the body of our community. Thank you. Yes.
I have a question about that particular tombstone.
Yeah.
That stone is on the corner of that T.
It is.
It's on the southeast corner of that
Right.
intersection.
It is.
So when that Model T car was parked there, it was on the opposite, it was on the west side.
It was on the west side of that north-south roadway. That's right.
Jay,
Yeah.
because I've always been interested in this too, for my personal reasons with my father. We had a neighbor who was quite old and was around at that time. He's been gone for a long time. He told us where they were buried. And his burial area is near that, but it's in that lower section of the old section of the cemetery on the south side.
Right. That's the place most frequently named.
It goes down
Mhm.
and there's a big tree there now.
Mhm.
But I could take you to his grave, and right beyond that, he says it's where Papa's.
The things that stick in a person's mind aren't always, I know you've all had the experience of being dead certain about something or other, and you go back and you're trying to find it, and I'm not talking about short-term stuff, but things that just, in your mind's eye, you have this vivid mental image, and it's just like a photograph to you, and years later you go back and you find out, no, that's not how it was at all. So what I'm thinking is, when I go back, I've gone back there and tried to reconstruct what I thought I knew that Dad had told me, I'm not so sure. My memory gets better the more I read. So that brought the next logical question was, well, that's happened to me in 50 years. What are the memories, 40-year-old memories, of a traumatized 8-year-old? How accurate are those images? I imagine some of them are just really photographic, and yet others, I suspect, were just overwhelmed in the whole, just too much to process. And then, just as things had changed out there in my memory, so they had changed in the 40 years prior to that, between the time Dad saw what he saw and the time he told him. So, it's like you hear this fence comes up a lot of times. I've heard, I don't know how many sources, they say, oh, they were over the fence. Jack, you've brought that up with different people. They say, oh, they were over the fence. Well, if you go out there now, there's only one fence that you see. And if you're recounting something, this is 90 years ago, let's say you're a person who's still living and saw that, you saw it as a child, maybe all that stuck in your head was the fence. That's the main landmark that you can think of. And, there was obviously a fence on this other end. I mean, it was farm. But now, the only fence you see is on the south side, and it's not in too good a shape, not very new.
Yeah, I think another thing that throws a lot of people off, they're judging an area by today, and like what we tried to do was go back and reconstruct the area as it was back then. The roads were different, the roads were, there was no paved road, it was
Right.
all mud roads. And to see it today and how it was back then, even the appearance of the cemetery looked like a bunch of wires, I mean, there was no grass.
Yeah.
So that can mislead a lot of people too.
Right. Yeah.
I'm with the American Legion Riders from Post 147 in
Uh-huh.
Marion. And our interest is in Herrin Massacre.
Right.
You had a picture of a gravesite with a headstone of Antonio.
Right.
Is there no evidence of that left? I mean, is it a
No,
gravestone?
if you look at the picture, best guess is it was probably a wooden marker, for all indication. And it apparently only stood for a few, I don't know, I'm going to say a few years. I think that may even be an optimistic assessment given the general feelings in the area. It's hard to imagine that people, as bitter as they were, that they would have left the monument.
Do we know who erected the headstone?
The American Legion.
The American Legion did.
Yeah, the American Legion, the representative from Chicago came down, word had gotten, of course, the Chicago papers were covering this and really making hay with it. And the representative from Chicago, when he found out about Malkovich, and the reason this is known is because that was how Malkovich was identified, as his discharge papers were on his body. And so they were able to see, what his history was, and that was when the American Legion got involved. And my understanding is that then at his behest, the local chapter arranged to have this marker put on. It doesn't look like a very substantial marker, and I know of nobody reporting having seen it much after the time that Carter put this in.
What, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine.
But, at this point, I understand the confusion or what have you about where the graves may be marked. Has anyone from your organization or anything contacted the American Legion and said, hey, can you give us some support in, bringing this forth and what have you? The American Legion is 3.5 million members across the country, and they throw their weight behind something that, a lot of people are gonna listen.
Right.
You know.
We have not. Again, we felt like that was sort of outside our purpose, or the focus of what we were doing. I mean, let's face it, it's all just an exercise in frustration until we locate it.
Sure.
And we haven't had any real consensus in memory about that.
Well, here's the issue that I see. Being with the writers, and of course our interest is in this veteran and making sure that he's not forgotten about.
Right.
He does have a proper military burial. And of course, what the issues are with it, what we've spoken about, the American Legion can kind of put their weight behind making sure that there's a definitive location. And if we can at least locate Malkovich, then you've got a pretty good idea of where the rest of the graves would be. So what I'm saying is, we're interested in that anyway. I'd like to get with yourself and get some of your facts and your evidence or what have you, and let's present it to the American Legion and say, hey, look, we don't care what the politics are.
Right.
All we're interested in is giving this veteran his proper burial.
Right.
But if the American Legion will say, we'll give you, and they may even give us resources. I'm not going to say they will, I'm not going to say they won't, but if they'll at least give us their support and, help us find Malkovich, then you've got a pretty good idea where to find the rest
Well,
of
I think, and you guys can correct me if I'm speaking this, but, I think our group would be happy to cooperate and to the extent that we would share what we know or believe or suspect, however you want to phrase it. We would be happy to share the resources that we have and the thoughts that we had that led us to this, but I don't think any of us is interested in any direct involvement beyond that. That's going to be somebody else's doing, and we welcome it. As I said in my closing remarks, we want closure on this, but we also don't want it to be like a bull in a china shop. We would like it to be done in a respectful, orderly, and as I said, as minimally invasive a manner as we can do it. But we would have no objections to any party that had the resources to pursue that in a proper way.
We want to pursue that on behalf of Mr. Malkovich, and to make sure that, as I said before, our interest is strictly in him and getting a proper burial.
I'm not sure, but it strikes me that I've heard that he's not the only veteran among those.
That's correct.
So that may be another thing that will need to be followed up on.
We can get a list of names, and if we have proof that they're veterans or what have you, we can take it to the American Legion.
Pretty much pinpointed where I think it is. You feel like technology, modern technology that.
Well, from my understanding, and I may be wrong, and like I said, I'm new to this, but from my understanding, it's not a matter of having the technology, it's a matter of politics may say, some people wanting those graves to remain buried.
There are elements of all of it. And, you know, anybody going into it just has to be mindful of all the different considerations there are. But as I said, we would welcome anything that's done that is done in a respectful and considerate way. And we really don't, I mean, we're not in a position to say anything other than just to express our own opinions. I will say one thing that's going to complicate the matter is that right now, if we are as precise in our location as we feel we are, there are trees growing up right in the middle of it. There are, though, if you go out and walk that spot, I've been through cemeteries all my life. Started in genealogy when I was, you know, still in grade school, and so I've poked around almost all the cemeteries in the area, and I have seen a lot of grave sinks. And there are things right there that sure look like grave sinks to me. That's not something that you can say. There are a lot of things that can cause a hole, you know, in the ground, and you know, until you get somebody with some expertise in on it, you don't know. Yeah, John.
Jake, by the way, great presentation. With the use of geometry and the study of camera angle and along with history. I was going to ask, you know, there is technology primarily used by law enforcement, but also paleontologists, archaeologists use it that can actually scan and make a pretty good guess as to whether bodies are there or not. And did you investigate what those would cost?
No, because I said that is beyond the scope of what we set out to do. What we did was never intended.
No.
This was something that just, as I said, Jack and Brent were having a conversation, and the rest of us just kind of got caught up in it. And in the process of kicking this thing around, some of these things about the photographic record just seemed like there was material there that if you applied a little science and logic to, you could get more out of the pictures than most people so far had done. Most people look at, well, there's nothing here to nothing here to say. And so we followed it to that point. But to go beyond that, as I said, we're happy to share our brilliance or our ignorance, whichever it turns out to be. We're happy to share with you. But at least speaking for myself, I don't see a direct involvement beyond that. Now, having said that, if the time ever comes that they're pretty sure they got it and they're going to pull out a bone, I'd sure like to be there. But one thing that I will say, and this was the feeling of the group, and again, correct me if I'm amiss. Nobody in our group is really, I think if we had our way, we would do whatever it took to verify that some of the bodies at least are in the location. And then we would like to see the spot memorialized, not individuals necessarily, but to do wholesale excavation of the area, moving bodies, disturbing the remains of these people. I don't think it would be a respectful thing to do. I don't think it's a necessary thing to do. But we do feel strongly that it's important, as I said, to put closure on this, to bring a measure of healing to the community, to identify it, try to verify it if we can, and having done so, to appropriately memorialize it. That's our feeling.
If there's veterans buried there, then it should be a non-issue. I mean, you know, the American Legion would be behind it fully. If there's veterans there, then, you know, we'll memorialize them. Regardless of what their history, they were veterans. Right.
Mr. Pretty, I don't know, Mrs. Fry, maybe you can answer this. Approximately how many veterans do we suspect are actually buried there?
Well, we
I
think.
mean, we know one for sure, but you say possibly more than that.
Possibly 16.
Oh,
We
no,
don't, no.
veterans. You
Oh,
said how many
Veterans.
veterans?
No, I can't answer that. I was running Ancestry.com last night on Mr. Overton, and I found his draft notice and his
Okay.
service record.
So
on-
possibly two.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would have been
So-
Nathan D. Overton from Poseyville,
From
Indiana.
Poseyville, Indiana.
And to my knowledge, I'm glad I didn't know you'd found that. I'm glad you did, because that was one that kind of preyed on me a little bit, was that one, because it's just this kid, and I don't know, to my knowledge, he was never moved. But, you know, it would require some more investigation.
We're also much hampered by the fact that, 10 or 11 of them, we have no name. There's no name.
That's,
On the
oh, I'm
death
sorry,
certificate.
go ahead.
Did you know there was another victim that died in October?
Yes, Ignatz Cabinas.
Yeah, we have his death
And the record
certificate.
at the courthouse at Marion says that he's buried in Herrin City Cemetery.
All of the death certificates say that, except for the ones that were moved originally. They just gave the location as Herrin Cemetery, which what we're saying, it depends on how technical you want to get about it. At least some of them are within the confines of the boundaries of the cemetery, but not on platted lots.
I have wondered if he was buried with the rest of them.
Cabinas, my understanding is that I don't know.
The picture shows graves on each side.
Yeah, I can't,
Drug graves.
I can't answer that. I thought about that myself, but somebody else may know where Cabinas, do you know where the one that died 3 months later after the amputation?
It says-
The strikebreaker or the Indian
Yeah.
guy?
Uh-huh.
I don't know where I
I'm
found all the
thinking-
Indian people. I found the 3 Indian.
Yeah,
people.
right. Well, Ignatz Cabinas, he was a Czech,
The newspaper said that his family claimed the body.
well, I know they came down and identified it. I know that, and claimed it, I
It
guess.
says he was buried here.
Okay. But as to the location, I don't know. You brought up, when talking about the death certificates, that's kind of an interesting thing too. When the very first thing right out of the chute, there were death certificates issued for all the bodies. And as somebody mentioned earlier, there were numbers assigned to the bodies. This was the coroner's. The coroner needed to conduct an investigation and inquest into this, and they assigned these identifications and numbers to the bodies. Death certificates were issued, and I've forgotten the precise number, but about, I don't know, 11 or 12 of them initially were unknowns. Some of them subsequently were identified, but the original death certificates were not amended, and no new death certificate was issued as these unknowns were identified. And I asked the people in the Vital Statistics section over there in the administration building about that. You know, is there a procedure for this? Of course, now this is less likely to happen than it was then, but they couldn't give me an answer. But to all indications, there were whatever 18, 19 death certificates issued from that day. A bunch of them said unknown, and then within a few days after the death certificate was issued, they were identified. And you even know which unknown they refer to, because there's a number correlation between it. But no effort was made to either correct the original death certificate or issue a new one. It just didn't happen. Of course, you know, the Vital Statistics Act, I think, didn't even take place until 1914, and it's quite a while catching up, and a lot of births and deaths never got recorded. Okay. Anybody else?
This is a bit off the issue, but when you said you went to the site, was there any physical evidence that remained of the mine, or?
At the time that when I was a kid and Dad was showing me all this, he just basically said, you know, it was over there. And that was back when Crenshaw Crossing still had the rural mailboxes up there at the intersection, and the road to Dog Walk went, you know, things were different than they are now. But he just showed me, and that was one of the things that I had sort of gotten muddled in my own mind, was where he had told me the location of Lester Mine was, because that was all mined again. I want to say Gordon Forsyth did that, but somebody mined that again, and that road, there's a lot of stuff got changed out there, and it's hard to keep it straight. But my understanding is that the pit, I guess, is still there. It would be somewhere out, maybe just the other side of where Dawson Gladys Armstrong's place was, out there.
Where your relationship to Vandyville Road? East of it?
Well, Vandyville Road would come out on Crenshaw, west of there. This is Skyline Drive that goes on, we used to call it Robert Hall Road.
Yeah.
All right. Well, actually, probably the closest thing, the test range for Holy Maths and General Dynamics is somewhere real close. The strip is somewhere within, yeah.
I work for General Dynamics, and it is on the property out there.
Okay.
Right.
When the water's low, you can actually still see pieces of that equipment in the
Okay.
bottom of that strip mine.
Okay. Thank you very much.
We'd like to thank you very much. If anyone else, if any other groups have some kind of views or something, we'd like to say that they're welcome to present those also. I do want to let you know that our membership drive is always the October to October, so those of you that are members, it's time to renew your membership. Last year we held off on raising the dues, but this year we can't. It'll be $25 membership, and what that covers is your 12 newsletters. That's the exact cost. The cost became, to send those out became more than what we were taking in. That's why we had to go do that. But if you would like to join, that's fine. If you'd just like to give us your emails and be notified about things, that's fine. Always watch the newspapers and watch for Cheryl's columns, because as I said, the way this works is just when somebody volunteers to talk, we throw something up, and sometimes we might have only 3 or 4 days advance notice, so always follow Cheryl to keep up with all that. Also, if you have emails or something, sometimes you can get out. We thank you very much for coming this evening.